around 20 to 1. So we've got 3 fantastic presentations to listen to. So just another couple of minutes, like I said, to give to people time to join. Okay, so it's just about 3 minutes past 12. So I'd just like to get going with today's practice-based research seminar and start by introducing Rosie McManus, who's going to give us her presentation about the experiences of autistic people and their parents surrounding disclosure of their diagnosis. Thank you very much, Rosie. Take it away.
Hi, so I'm Rosie. I work in Sheffield across 2 paediatric teams, so in an autism diagnosis multidisciplinary team, and also working with pre-verbal 2 to 4-year-old autistic children and their parents. So for my master's dissertation, I wanted to explore the experiences of autistic people and their parents around the disclosure from the parent to the child of their autism diagnosis. My motivation is thinking about how a lot of children are diagnosed with autism when they're quite young, so the diagnosis is often given to the parent and the child isn't always involved in the discussion. So I wanted to know more about how the diagnosis is shared with the child later on. So I started off with a literature review, and I'll do a really brief summary now. For the parent experiences, I looked at how they experience the diagnostic process and also the disclosure to their child. In terms of disclosing the diagnosis, there was quite limited research. It's unknown how many parents receive a diagnosis but don't disclose it to their child. Some parents report concerns about their child understanding the diagnosis and the potential for stigma, but others feel like it improves self-awareness and self-advocacy. Quite often, some studies have found that the difference between disclosure is just the part of the journey in terms of the timeline that they're on from diagnosis to disclosure and the age of the child. A lot of parents felt it could be quite empowering for their child and build confidence. And there's some challenges that parents report about talking about autism, lacking confidence in their ability and wanting accessible resources in different formats. So I also looked at the experiences of autistic people. The diagnostic process isn't always concurrent with the disclosure, and it's the disclosure that can help to understand themselves and how they experience the world. Some young autistic people report that a delay from the time of diagnosis to disclosure can evoke quite a range of negative reactions. In terms of the impact of individual identity, of course, people have lived with the impact of autism for their whole lives, but learning about it and understanding the diagnosis can influence their view of themselves and their past and their future experiences. Some people describe difficulties pre-diagnosis, including trying to fit in, confusing interactions, and perceived failures, and report feeling relief after diagnosis. But in contrast, others feel like the diagnosis can be quite oppressive or isolating. In general, though, there's a feeling that the disclosure is needed for that transition from misunderstanding to acceptance. It's really important that information is always presented in a positive and neurodiverse way to associate with positive feelings about a diagnosis. So overall, the literature about individual experiences of autism diagnosis and disclosure is quite variable. There's concerns about the wider societal impact, but on a personal level, self-awareness of a diagnosis seems to have quite a positive impact on an individual's identity and their self-esteem. So any potential difficulties from disclosing shouldn't necessarily be a reason to withhold the information. Jones in 2001 suggested that the process of autism disclosure should be ongoing and gradual. There's a lot of factors to consider, including when and how and by whom. And Jones listed these 10 questions, which I thought were a really useful thinking point for before the disclosure. There's a need to be sensitive to developmental needs, be accepting and non-stigmatizing. So I wanted to explore the lived experiences of parents' decision-making and before the disclosure, and of autistic people in learning about their diagnosis for the first time and what those conversations were like. So after the literature review, I formulated these research questions. I used the qualitative methodology because I wanted to find out about lived experiences. I'd intended to do 2 phases of data collection. So first an online questionnaire and then semi-structured interviews to get more nuanced information. But unfortunately, because of COVID, there were some limitations and recruiting was a really big one. I couldn't use any of my planned recruitment methods. And in the end, I recruited entirely through Twitter. I developed 2 questionnaires, one for the autistic participants and one for parents. And within those, I got information about their background details about that initial disclosure experience and their perceived benefits and risks of disclosure. The semi-structured interviews for the more detailed information were meant to be with a subset of participants after the questionnaires. But like I said, I really struggled to recruit for that. The plan was to conduct those over the phone or over email, depending on participant preferences. Email-based semi-structured interviews can actually be better for some autistic people because phone calls can be stressful and emails are asynchronous. So some individuals like to control the pace of the responses, and that permanent textual record can be really reassuring and can aid recall and reflection. So these are the participant details. For the parents, all were mothers aged 40 to 50. 2 of them disclosed 1 to 2 years before the diagnosis, 5 soon after diagnosis, and one disclosed 5 years later. I only had 3 autistic participants. One was diagnosed at 3 and informed at 11. One was diagnosed in childhood and accidentally found out in adulthood during an unrelated medical appointment. And the third sought their own diagnosis. So once I'd gathered all of that data, I analysed it using thematic analysis, which produced the 5 themes, which are in sort of dark grey. And they reflected the experiences around disclosure for both groups. And within each theme, there were 2 to 3 sub-themes as well. All the participants described their disclosure journey following a sort of cyclical progression of the 3 stages in the middle of preparation, disclosure, and consequences. And it felt like it formed a real ongoing process where individuals move repeatedly between the 3, and the themes really fitted within that as well. So the first stage of disclosure is preparation, which had 2 main themes. Why now is about why disclosure should take place, and participants' experiences about triggers for disclosure. There was a need for answers, which was where parents discussed having a perception that their child knew about their difficulties already or was asking questions. There's a right to know, so that reflected a feeling that it was important that information wasn't withheld. And some parents even discussed the diagnosis before the assessment. And whose decision is it? Is about who decides when and why to disclose based on the children's behaviour, but it wasn't really clear what the indicators were. 2 parents reported that it was actually disclosed during the assessment appointment, and one really liked that, but the other felt really unprepared. The other theme within preparation is planning what to say. So there's an expectation that the disclosure has a certain level of knowledge, needing to be well informed and plan ahead, seeking advice and information gathering. So 4 of the parents were actually speech therapists, and they talked about relying on their professional experience. Some people spoke to other professionals or parents or autistic family members, or looked at books and charities and internet resources. Support was quite inconsistent, and some parents felt they needed more. Finally, several participants talked about it being this ongoing process, which should begin early. And quite a few talked about revisiting the conversation whenever experiences happened that related their diagnosis to those lived experiences. The second stage is the disclosure, and there was only one theme here, the role of the parent. So there were 3 sub-themes. The first one was following the child's lead, which is about the importance of timing the disclosure carefully and following the child's signals about how to approach the conversation at an appropriate level. All the participants talked about the importance of openness, honesty, and truthfulness. And finally, celebrating neurodiversity. So being really positive about the diagnosis and reassuring for the child, and identifying areas of strength as well as challenges. And finally, the last stage of disclosure is the consequences, which is the impact of the disclosure on the child and those around them. So there was increased understanding. The first sub-theme is making sense of themselves. So the impact of the disclosure on their understanding of their current self and past experiences. And participants reflected that the child is often quite aware of the differences, and that disclosure would help them to understand why they're different. Participants felt they can develop others' understanding of the child, particularly in education, in healthcare, and in workplaces. And wider disclosure emerged from them talking about how they had to disclose to a wider network of family and friends and acquaintances. In particular, comments about older family members struggling to understand the diagnosis, and really variable experiences about disclosing to school. And the final theme is moving forward. So recognising the impacts, particularly the child's developing understanding of how their diagnosis relates to their strengths and challenges, and how they can use that to their advantage. And also community support. So it gave the opportunity for some people with autism to seek information and support from others, mostly online through Twitter, Reddit, blogs, and using hashtags. So reflecting on the research questions, overall my findings sort of reflected the existing literature about experiences of disclosure. For the first question, parents took quite similar approaches, feeling that their children had a right to know. They reflected that cyclical nature of the discussion with a gradual drip feeding of information at appropriate levels, which allowed their children to accept the diagnosis and integrate it with their understanding of themselves. For the second one, experiences were mostly positive, while acknowledging that it's quite a difficult event. Preparation tends to fall on the disclosure to find the appropriate information to share, whereas consequences are obviously more impactful for the autistic child, with that upheaval of making sense of experiences and moving forward. Both groups described, for the third question, this perception of the ongoing process, and reflected really similar values around honesty and celebrating neurodiversity. There were quite a few big limitations, obviously. I think that's probably expected in a master's dissertation, and especially during COVID. So the participant sample was really homogenous. All the parents were white British mothers, actively engaging with autism-related hashtags on Twitter, and half of them were speech therapists. So there wasn't much representation from other groups, like fathers, minority groups, people with literacy difficulties, or from parents who hadn't disclosed yet. And also, I really didn't have enough responses from autistic people. It was just really difficult to recruit. And most importantly is the clinical implications. This is my last slide. So professionals need to awareness that parents often take the role of disclosure, and having those cyclical discussions, which is often appropriate. And so professionals just need to be positioned to offer advice and support if parents seek it. Services need to be really clear about where parents can get guidance, either within their local offer or from charities or organisations, so that they can signpost families. Guidance should include when and how to disclose to a child within that gradual and ongoing process, and how to give information in a developmentally sensitive way, how to frame the diagnosis in terms of strengths, and also some guidance about how to share the diagnosis with others, like extended family and peers and school, would be really useful for some people. Obviously, prescriptive resources aren't always that helpful. It needs to be really nuanced and quite flexible, because every family experiences it differently, and they can't just be prescribed things. And finally, a lot of that is just talked about where parents can get support for disclosure, but it's really important that autistic individuals can also access support and signposting after the disclosure. So thank you for listening. That's my details if anyone wants any more information. And then I've just got these 2 slides of references that were resources, articles I found really useful. And that's everything.
Thank you very much, Rosie. That was brilliant. I should have said at the beginning of the presentation, if anyone has any questions for any of our presenters, please do pop them in the chat and I'll pick them up and pass them on. But my tardiness in passing that on to our audience means that I get the opportunity to ask a question while other people maybe construct their own. Firstly, well done for doing all that work during lockdown. That's really impressive to have got any data at all. Having, had similar trouble with my own research, similar problems, I completely empathise with how stressful and difficult it was to rearrange a research project, a qualitative research project during the pandemic. So congratulations on doing that. That's impressive and deserves a round of applause in and of itself. I was wondering about your questionnaire, and whether that was like how you decided on the questions within that questionnaire, and what type of response did you get? So was it open questions with a written response, or did you have any sort of quantitative data that you collected from that?
The only quantitative data really was the sort of background information about the participants. It was mainly quite open questions. I did run it by a few parents beforehand, so I can't think of the word for it, but when you do a sort of test run to get a bit of feedback about questions, and generally people were quite happy with them. I think I made a few tweaks, but and then I just, because of the difficulties with recruiting, I didn't manage to do that with any autistic participants. Yeah, and I just used Google Forms, which is really easy to use. So it was quite neat. Yeah.
Brilliant, well done, thank you. And we haven't got any questions in the chat, but again, if people think of things during the next presentation, then Rosie will be able to respond to you. I just got one further question about your autistic person where the disclosure had come out in adulthood.
Yeah.
How did that feel for them?
They found that really hard, I think, because they've been diagnosed quite young, and then they saw it on the screen in an appointment. So it wasn't even that the professional said it to them. They just they saw it on the computer screen and asked why it said it, and found out like that. And so obviously that professional won't have been in a position to be prepared to talk about it either. So I think it was a really difficult thing, and they kind of felt from their responses that that it wasn't helpful that way. They found it really difficult to come to terms with it. Once they had done, they were then accessing, I think that they were using Reddit and a few other internet resources to meet other people who had not that experience of disclosure, but similar life experiences to them, so that they could relate. And they felt like knowing sooner would have helped them to understand a lot more, particularly in secondary school. I know in the research that's not the case for everybody. So some people find that the disclosure is really upsetting, and teenagers sometimes don't want to know that about themselves. They don't like to think of themselves as having a difference. Yeah, that was definitely quite an interesting thing to have come out, and an interesting experience. I would have loved it if they'd wanted to do the follow-up interview. I think I would have got some really interesting data, but they didn't feel that they wanted to, which is obviously fine. Yeah,
that in and of itself is a really interesting research question going forward, isn't it? How do other people feel who have experienced that disclosure later on? I think that's really poignant. Thank you ever so much for that. That was absolutely lovely. We are going to have to move on to our next speaker, but as I said, if you've got any questions for Rosie, then please either contact her directly or pop them in the chat box and she'll be able to respond to them now. So welcome Christine Goodban, who's our second presenter, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how speech and language therapists develop their practice. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Christine Goodban. I'm a speech and language therapist working in Sussex. And unlike Rosie, who has done her research, I'm presenting to you about what I've got planned to research for my professional doctorate. So hopefully I'll be able to move the screen. Okay, so what I'm going to cover today is a little bit about me and my background. I want to talk to you about the background to the research topic and why I want to look into this area, covering my aims. I'm going to talk to you about the Ferris wheel imagery and why my cover had lots of pictures of Ferris wheels. I've got a circle and lens model that I want to talk you through that I've developed, and kind of reimagining this Ferris wheel imagery, and then discussion and questions. So a little bit about me. I've been a speech and language therapist for 18 years, and I've had a kind of wide range of experience. I've worked in community learning disability services, and that's where I'm working currently. But I've also worked in adult acute rehab. I've done quite a lot on paediatric dysphagia and worked in special schools. And throughout all of my different jobs and kind of career path, I've always had an interest in education in the profession, both education of speech and language therapists and also outside of the profession. I did a PG cert a few years ago, so teaching qualification, and that kind of led me to the point really thinking about how we teach and how we learn in the profession. And then in 2018 and 19, I was fortunate to do a clinical improvement scholarship. And within that, I looked at using mouth care models and simulation to teach staff how to do mouth care. I currently am working, as I said, in a learning disability team, and I have a day a week where I'm looking at practice education, doing a PEF role. And I'm about to start my professional doctorate at the University of Chichester. So that's been my kind of path. So the background and justification for my research, there's little literature around practice development in speech and language therapy. There's a lot more in nursing and midwifery as professions. They have more roles in practice development. They have more written, and obviously acknowledging it's a much larger workforce. There are also a lack of specific job roles in allied health profession groups, so it's rare to find a kind of practice development allied health profession role, although those are developing. And that kind of got me to really think about why, and is there a need to do more research in this area? Within my kind of journey to this point, I've really looked at how I am as a researcher and kind of positioning myself as an insider within the profession of speech and language therapy. And also I've really explored my desire to have both a personal and a professional legacy. So what I would like my practice contribution to be, and kind of my professional legacy, is to establish a practice development model for use within speech and language therapy, because I don't see that we have one. So my research question is how speech and language therapists develop their practice, and I'm planning to do an autoethnographic inquiry using thematic analysis to identify common themes of practice development approaches. And I'm going to tell you how I'm going to plan to do that. So my research aims, there are 5. I'm going to start looking at practice development approaches in the nursing and midwifery literature, because as I said, it's far better developed. And to use that to draw out aspects that would be really useful to ask people about, to develop a semi-structured interview schedule. And I want to develop my semi-structured interviews with a participant group of speech and language therapists. I've decided to use an autoethnographic methodology because I have kind of developed this sense of self within the speech and language therapy participant group. So looking at the fact that I don't want to be a researcher looking on a kind of participant group. Actually, I feel like I am an insider in the group, and therefore I want to be involved in the co-creation and knowledge within this research. I want to then use my autoethnographic methodology to explore the range of practice development practices that happen for the people in the research, and from that then use thematic analysis to as a theoretical framework to look through, the activities that are discussed and some of the journeys that people have had. And then I also want to use a critical feminist lens. Our profession is so highly gendered in terms of the proportion of male and female in our profession, much more than other allied health professions or other wider health professions. And I think that is something that needs to be acknowledged and looked at. And also some researchers would say that some of the work that we do is inherently gendered as well. So I feel like that's an aspect that really needs to be drawn out and looked at. And I've described it as this critical feminist lens. And my aim, my final aim, is to propose a model of practice development that's relevant to the diverse speech and language therapy workforce in the UK and critically appraise this model. So the carriages and the Ferris wheel, the reason I came up with the Ferris wheel is that I was trying to kind of visually represent all of the different aspects of my research, the parts that I thought were really important that I wanted to develop. And I was looking at kind of spider web models and things, and it didn't seem to be dynamic enough for me. And actually that's when I considered a Ferris wheel, because it's dynamic and moving, it represents a journey. And I felt it allowed me to kind of take a step back and take a more of a reflexive position. And when I show you my kind of Ferris wheel model, you'll see that I've left carriages empty because I know that there are aspects of my research which aren't developed yet, aren't settled. And I felt like I wanted to represent the fact that this is a process of co-construction, and it will change as time goes on. So here's my visual representation. So all of these aspects I feel are areas that need to be considered, or I will be looking at as part of my research. So the wider context of the research journey, again, that relates quite a lot to me as a researcher, and there are elements of it which really are around me as a researcher, and then there are other elements which are kind of wider and bigger. So things like the context of COVID, and the personal professional legacy, all of these elements I felt I'm going to be looking at in my research, with that kind of central question of how speech and language therapists develop their practice in the middle. So in terms of trying to show my conceptual model, again, I'm a very visual learner, and I wanted to construct something as I applied to the university to say, this is the research that I want to do. I developed this circle and lens diagram to show my research positioning, methodology and theoretical framework, because it can be really hard to kind of tease out all of those different things. And it did take a long time to kind of work out what methodology, what theoretical framework I was planning to use. So the type of research that I'm doing is qualitative research, and it's interpretivist work. So it's not that there is a kind of absolute truth. This is knowledge that's going to be created and co-constructed. My methodology, as I said, is going to be autoethnographic inquiry, and I want to use thematic analysis as a theoretical framework to make sense of the knowledge that's created. And then up in the corner, I've got this representation of this critical feminist lens, which I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like, but I just felt like it's an element that needed to be represented for the reasons that I've already mentioned. So in terms of deepening my understanding, the first question, which some of you might already have asked and may ask me, is what is meant by practice development, and that is a really, really good question. So that will be my first activity, is to really hone down what is meant by practice development, what in the widest possible sense, but also what is meant in my research. It's likely that there are different meanings in different contexts, and it could be that it's too large, and actually I need to hone it into practice development in certain clinical areas, or looking at clinical academic careers and how people with clinical academic careers develop their practice. So that needs to be looked at. I've looked at focus semi-structured interviews as an approach, but as I want to be co-constructing the knowledge, I need to really think carefully about things like note-taking and recording, because even the presence of somebody leading a semi-structured interview, taking notes and recording actually changes the focus and the dynamics of kind of who's in control. So that needs to be really carefully thought through. I need to think how this work links to other work on clinical academic careers, and there's a growing research base around that area, which is great. And I need to think about, my goal is to develop this model of practice development, but will what I find out in my research actually lead me to a model, or is that a whole other piece of work, and are there important steps in between? And what about aspects that I've pushed to one side? So as I said, I've got a real interest in simulation, and I want to think about, the gendered natures of work. But what happens if in my research those things don't emerge as themes? What will my response be as a researcher, and how will I kind of park that, or how will I steer my research? So again, it's about this autoethnographic approach is really about knowing yourself as a researcher and knowing what biases you come with, and kind of very much acknowledging those. Oh, sorry, wrong way. So returning to my Ferris wheel imagery, I found this image, which actually represents kind of what I feel is happening already, and I haven't even actually started my research yet. So rather than those nice complete carriages, which are all nice and distinct and neat, actually what I'm finding is it's becoming a little bit of a leak and a bit of a mess. But I think that is okay, and I think at this stage of my journey, I'm acknowledging that will happen. The dynamic nature of the search means that the picture at the end will look very different from the picture at the start. I fully anticipate that my research question will change. There's a lot more to explore, and this will happen as part of my doctoral journey. So very much I feel like there are aspects that are leaking, and that I'm comfortable with. So that's the end of what I've got prepared, but I would really value any comments or questions, because this is the first time that I've presented this to speech and language therapists. So obviously I've been working with the University of Chichester, and I should have said that's the university I'm going to be doing my professional doctorate with. But I guess, yeah, I'd be really interested in comments about whether you think that this research is necessary, and can you see yourself fitting into that? Thank you. I've got some references as well.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. That's fabulous. Really interesting presentation. And firstly, I'm just so impressed that you've done all that thought and preparation at the outset of your professional doctorate. I mean, I'm coming towards the end of my PhD now, and I'm still working through some of those things. So, I mean, I think that's really sort of fabulous starting place for your whole doctoral journey. So congratulations with that. And I have got a question related to that as well, but we've got a question from one of our audience members, so I'm going to take their question first. Kate has said, this sounds like a really interesting and relevant research project. Wholeheartedly agree with. And Kate works at a HEI and was wondering how your research might shed light on how we teach clinical practice.
Absolutely, really, really good question, Kate. And I guess that's why I wanted to tell you about the fact that I've got such an interest in education, and I'm doing this PEF role as well, because I think we need to think about the wider context of the workforce that people are entering, and that's important to know what support is necessary, how people's careers and journeys might go, and we need to be preparing students at the start of their career and kind of seeing it as a whole journey. And what I'm anticipating is that there might be some common themes, but that it will be different. It will be different in different professional clinical contexts, and I'm anticipating that things like motivation, drive, support from managers, support, wider support, will be themes that will come through. But yeah, who knows?
Thank you. Kate also said that she's at the beginning of her own research journey and identifies with the leakage and the mess factors, which
Yeah.
I, again, can wholeheartedly empathise with too. Lots of mess and leak. And again, congratulations for holding that and sitting comfortably with that. Again, I think that's a really impressive development for somebody so early in their research career. So
thank you. I mean, I'll just say with the professional doctorate at the University of Chichester, I've done the prep year, so the year where you work out your methodology and your positioning, ready to say, from September I'm good to go and start my literature review. So it's a kind of 5-year program, and I've done 1 year ready to start the research. But thank you.
So Catherine has asked, there are so many different settings that speech and language therapists work within. How many you plan to look at?
Yeah, really good question. I haven't got an answer for that just yet. I was anticipating doing semi-structured interviews with between 12 and 15 people, but I anticipate that I will have to focus my interest into either a clinical area or a particular teaching method like simulation or clinical academic careers. I think that will naturally come, because what I don't want to do is do research that is so wide and broad it doesn't actually it can't be applied to the wider profession. So that's kind of something that's really important for me to think about quite early on.
Great. I was just wondering, those are the questions from the chat, but if anyone's got any further questions, then please pop them in the chat, and I'm sure Chris will be able to respond to them during our final presentation. But just before we move on to Caroleen, you mentioned practice development roles in other professions. Could you expand on those? Do you know what those look like and whether those are models that would be applicable to speech and language therapy practice?
Yeah, I mean, what I know most about are actual roles. So for example, within the trust I work in, or within the hospital trust that I used to work in, there was a practice development team for nursing and midwifery. So, lots of posts, people actually working in those roles. And that's what I don't see within allied health professions, but I think it is coming. I think some of the work that I'm doing in my practice education role, which is focusing on students, is highlighting the need to have people in identified roles which can, their time is ring fenced to really focus on developing the workforce in a wider way. So yeah, definitely need to do more of the literature search around those other professions and how they develop. That work develops, but I think you can see it in roles, and that shows how investment has happened in those professions, and we're a bit further behind.
So interesting. We really look forward to hearing how that develops.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, any further questions, do pop them in the chat, and good luck with your onward research journey.
Thank you.
And yeah, and thank you very much for your presentation here today. So our final presentation is from Caroleen Shipster, and I'm not even going to try to say the name of the population that she works with, because I'll leave that challenge to her, who's much more practiced at it than I am. But she's talking about